She stood at the edge of the ballroom, a glass of untouched champagne in her hand, as the man she had loved for 3 years swept another woman across the dance floor. Laughter and music filled the vast hall of Delamere, but Lillian, Duchess of Delamere, heard none of it. She heard only the whispers that rustled behind silk fans and gloved hands. Poor Duchess, he has not looked at her once tonight. She forced her lips into a serene smile, the kind she had perfected over 3 long years, but inside something fragile was beginning to crack. The candlelight caught the emeralds at her throat, borrowed from the family vault, heavy and cold against her skin. Everything about this life was borrowed. Her title, her place, even the air she breathed in this grand house felt like it belonged to someone else. The woman in the Duke's arms was Lady Corinne Montclair, recently widowed and more beautiful than ever. Her golden hair gleamed under the chandeliers. Her laugh floated across the room like music. Alexander, the Duke of Delamere, looked at Corinne the way he had never once looked at his wife. His dark eyes held a warmth that Lillian had only ever dreamed of seeing directed at her. She had been so foolish, so terribly foolish. The music swelled, and Lillian quietly set her glass aside. No one noticed when she slipped through the terrace doors into the cool night air. The stars glittered indifferently above the gardens, and she pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the steady ache that had become her constant companion. She had loved Alexander Ashworth since the moment she first saw him at her father's country house, tall and serious, and carrying the weight of his title on his broad shoulders. When he had offered for her hand, she had believed it was a miracle. It was not a miracle, it was a transaction. Her father's debts had been crushing, and the old Duke, Alexander's father, had inserted a cruel clause into his will: marry within the year or lose the unentailed lands that kept Delamere prosperous. Lillian's family needed money. Alexander needed a wife. The match had been arranged in a fortnight, and Lillian, young and hopeful, had walked down the aisle with her heart in her hands. She had not known then that Alexander's heart already belonged to another woman, a woman who had married a wealthy earl and left England, leaving him bitter and closed. He had married Lillian out of duty, and he never let her forget it. Not with cruel words exactly, with something far worse: indifference. The first year she had tried. She had learned his preferences, seen to his comfort, worn the colors he liked, played the piano pieces he once mentioned enjoying. She had waited for him in the drawing-room each evening, hopping for a few minutes of conversation. Most nights he never came. When he did, he looked through her as if she were part of the furniture. The second year she had still hoped. A few moments of unexpected tenderness had fed her starving heart. The night she fell ill with fever, and he had sat by her bedside for an hour, his brow furrowed with something that might have been concern. The morning he complimented the roses she had arranged in the hall, small, foolish things. She had built entire palaces of hope upon them, and each one had crumbled. Now, at the start of her 4th year as his duchess, she stood alone in the garden and admitted the truth to herself. He would never love her. The return of Lady Corinne had made that painfully, irrevocably clear. The terrace door opened behind her. She did not turn. She knew the steady, measured footsteps too well. "You left the ball." His voice was low, almost accusing. Lillian smoothed her gown. "I needed air, Your Grace." Corinne noticed your absence. She was concerned. Of course. Corinne, always gracious, always thoughtful. Lillian wondered if the woman knew how expertly she twisted the knife. Probably. There was nothing accidental about the way Corinne's hand lingered on Alexander's arm, the way her laughter rang out whenever Lillian was near. "How kind of her," Lillian said, her voice flat. "Please reassure Lady Corinne that I am perfectly well." A pause. She could feel him studying her, perhaps noticing for the first time that she had not called him by his name. She had stopped doing that 6 months ago, and he had not remarked upon it. "You have been quiet lately," he said. Lillian finally turned. His face was half in shadow, the moonlight catching the hard line of his jaw. He was so handsome it still hurt to look at him. I did not think you would notice, Your Grace. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or annoyance. What is that supposed to mean? She held his gaze for a long moment, then shook her head. Nothing at all. I am tired. I believe I will retire. She curtsied, a perfect, formal gesture that put a wall of etiquette between them, and walked back inside. She did not look back. If she had, she might have seen the Duke of Delamere staring after her with an expression he himself did not understand. The days that followed marked a quiet shift in Lillian Fairfax, Duchess of Delamere. She stopped waiting. She no longer lingered in the breakfast room hoping he might join her. She rose early instead, put on a simple wool dress, and walked to the tenant farms on the estate's eastern edge. The steward, Mr. Daniel Whitmore, a kind-eyed man of 30 with a gentle manner, had mentioned that the roof of the Miller family's cottage had collapsed in the last storm. Lillian had always been good with practical matters, her mother having taught her that a lady's true duty was to the people who depended on her land. She had buried that part of herself trying to be the wife Alexander wanted. Now, she let it bloom again. She organized the repairs herself, speaking with the carpenter, arranging for supplies. She visited the sick child of a shepherd's wife, bringing broth and cool cloths for her fever. She listened to the worries of the farmers, noted which fields needed better drainage, and discussed crop rotations with Mr. Whitmore until the sun began to set. Word spread through the countryside. The Duchess was not a cold, distant lady shut up in her grand house. She was down in the mud with the rest of them, her hands ink-stained from writing letters of support, her hair pinned back with simple pins. The tenants began to love her, and Lillian, for the first time in years, began to feel like herself again. The only person who did not seem to notice was Alexander, or so she thought. A fortnight after the ball, Lillian returned to Delamere Hall just as the dinner bell rang. She had intended to take a tray in her room, her boots still damp from the stream she had crossed, but the butler informed her that the Duke was dining in the small parlor and had requested her presence. Requested, not commanded, that was unusual. She changed quickly into a gown of pale gray silk, pinned up her hair, and went downstairs. Alexander was already seated, a glass of wine in his hand. He looked up when she entered, and his gaze traveled over her with an expression she could not read. "You were out all day," he said. "Yes, there was a problem at the Miller's cottage." "I heard Whitmore mentioned it." She took her seat across from him. The table felt too wide. "Mr. Whitmore has been most helpful." Alexander's fingers tightened on the stem of his glass. "Has he?" It was not a question. Lillian looked at him curiously. There was a strange tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his mouth. He looked almost irritated. But why would he be irritated? He had never cared how she spent her days before. "Is something wrong, Your Grace?" she asked. He set the glass down with a quiet click. "Lady Carine mentioned that she rarely sees you at afternoon calls anymore. She finds it odd that the Duchess is so often absent from her own home." Lillian felt a flash of something hot and sharp. Carine, of course. The woman was like a splinter she could not remove. "Lady Carine is not the mistress of Delamere. I am. How I choose to spend my time is not her concern." Alexander's eyebrows rose. "That is direct." "I have learned to be direct, Your Grace. It saves time." For a moment, something almost like respect flickered in his dark eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar coolness. "See that your duties to this house are not neglected." "They are not." She met his gaze steadily. "Is that all?" He hesitated. She saw his jaw work as if he wanted to say something else. But then he simply nodded, and she rose, leaving her meal untouched, and walked out of the room with her head high. She did not see the way he stared at the empty doorway long after she was gone. The weeks turned warmer, spring melting into early summer. The gardens of Delamere burst into color, and Lillian spent more and more time outdoors, often in the company of Mr. Whitmore. He was an easy companion, never demanding, always respectful. He treated her not as a duchess, but as a capable, intelligent woman. When she suggested a new irrigation system for the lower fields, he listened seriously and then helped her draw up plans. When she laughed at his wry observations about the pompous land agent from the next county, he smiled as if her laughter was a gift. It was innocent, completely innocent, but to an outside observer it might have looked like something else. Alexander, watching from the window of his study one afternoon, saw his wife walking up the gravel path beside Whitmore. Her cheeks were flushed from the sun, her hair escaping its pins. She was laughing, really laughing, her whole face alight with it. Whitmore said something, and she turned to him, her hand briefly touching his sleeve in a gesture of easy familiarity. The Duke's chest tightened with an emotion he refused to name. He had never made her laugh like that. He had never even tried. He turned from the window abruptly, his jaw set. That evening, he sent for Mr. Whitmore and informed him that he was being reassigned to manage the northern property, 50 miles away. The steward looked surprised but accepted the decision with quiet dignity. When Lillian heard the news the next morning, she went very still. "Why?" she asked Alexander, finding him in the library. He did not look up from the ledger he was pretending to read. "It is a better position for him. The northern estate needs a firm hand. Mr. Whitmore has done excellent work here. The tenants trust him. Then they will learn to trust someone else." Lillian stared at his profile, the hard set of his shoulders, and a cold understanding washed over her. This was not about the estate. This was about her. He was punishing her, or perhaps punishing Whitmore, for the crime of being her friend. "You are being unfair," she said quietly. He finally looked up. His eyes were unreadable. "I am the Duke. I do not need to explain my decisions." "No," she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You never do." She left the library without another word, and Alexander was left with the echo of her disappointment, a sound that somehow cut deeper than any argument could have. A few days later, Lady Corinne arrived for a prolonged visit. She swept into Delamere Hall with trunks full of fashionable gowns and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She draped herself over the settee in the drawing room, praised Alexander's taste in every detail of the house, and subtly, expertly, excluded Lillian from every conversation. "Do you remember that summer at the lake, Alexander?" Corinne cooed at dinner. "You taught me to row, and I nearly capsized us both." A muscle in Alexander's jaw twitched. "I remember." Lillian cut her roast chicken into very small pieces and said nothing. "You were so patient," Corinne continued, her gaze sliding toward Lillian with a glitter of triumph. "But then, you always were patient with me." The silence stretched. Lillian set down her fork. "If you will excuse me, I find I have a headache." She stood, and for the first time Alexander's voice stopped her. "Stay." The word was soft, almost urgent. Lillian looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw something in his face she had never seen before. Confusion. As if he was only now realizing that something precious was slipping away, and he did not know how to hold on to it. She stayed, but she did not speak again for the rest of the meal. The breaking point came on a gray afternoon in late June. Lillian was in the orangery, tending to the lemon trees that had been her grandmother's pride. It was a quiet, private place, and she had come to think of it as her sanctuary. She did not expect Alexander to find her there. He stood in the doorway, his cravat loosened, his dark hair slightly disheveled. He looked as though he had not slept. "May I speak with you?" he asked. She brushed soil from her hands. "Of course, Your Grace." He winced almost imperceptibly at the formal address. "I have been thinking about us." Lillian's heart gave a painful lurch. She folded her hands in front of her and waited. "I know I have not been the husband you deserved," he said, the words seeming to cost him great effort. "I married you under difficult circumstances. There were things I believed, things I was told." He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. Lillian watched him, her expression unreadable. She had spent 3 years desperate for this conversation. Now that it was here, she felt only a strange, hollow exhaustion. "What things were you told?" she asked evenly. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a crack in his armor. "Someone sent me an anonymous letter before our engagement. It said that you and your family knew about my father's will, that you deliberately maneuvered to trap me into marriage, that your tears and your sweet smiles were all an act." Lillian felt the blood drain from her face. "And you believed it?" "I did not know what to believe. I was angry, grieving my father, still raw from—" He stopped, but she knew what he meant. "Still raw from losing Corinne." "So you punished me for 3 years," she said, her voice trembling despite herself. "For something I never did. For something I never even knew about." Alexander took a step toward her. "Lillian." "No," she held up a hand, and he stopped. "You never asked me. You never once gave me the chance to defend myself. You simply decided I was guilty and treated me like a stranger in my own home. Do you know what that was like? Do you have any idea?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and she turned away, pressing her fingers to her lips to hold back the sob that threatened to escape. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of him again. She had broken that promise 100 times in the privacy of her room. She would not break it here. "I am sorry," Alexander said. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. "I am so sorry." Lillian took a shaky breath and faced him again. "Why are you telling me this now?" He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because I cannot bear the distance between us anymore. Because I see you slipping away and it terrifies me. Because I think—" He swallowed hard. "I think I have been the greatest fool in England and I do not know how to fix it." Before she could respond, a commotion erupted from the front of the house. Carriage wheels, voices, the butler's hurried footsteps. Lillian and Alexander exchanged a bewildered look and hurried toward the entrance hall. A woman stood in the doorway, travel-worn and radiant, her dark hair tumbling from its pins. A small child clung to her skirts, and a tall, gentle-faced man stood behind her, holding a baby. "Charlotte," Alexander breathed. Lady Charlotte Ashworth, his younger sister, who had disappeared from society 5 years ago under a cloud of whispered scandal, stood in the hall of Delamere as if she had risen from the dead. She smiled, tears streaming down her face, and rushed toward her brother. But before she reached him, she stopped in front of Lillian. "There you are," Charlotte whispered and threw her arms around the Duchess. "There you are, my dearest friend, my savior." The hall fell utterly silent. Alexander stood frozen, his eyes wide with confusion. "Savior, what do you mean?" Charlotte pulled back, keeping one hand clasped tightly around Lillian's. Her eyes, so like her brother, shimmered with emotion. "Did you never tell him? Lillian, did you never tell him what you did for me?" Lillian shook her head, her face pale. "It was not my story to tell." "Then I will tell it now." Charlotte turned to face her brother, her chin lifted with quiet defiance. 5 years ago, when I made the gravest mistake of my life, when I was alone and terrified and carrying a child with no father who would claim me, it was Lillian who saved me. She was barely more than a girl herself, but she sold her mother's jewels, every last one, to pay for my passage to Italy. She arranged for me to stay with our great-aunt in Florence. She found a good man, my Daniel, who loved me despite everything, and she gave me the dowry that should have been her own inheritance so that I could marry him. Alexander's face had gone utterly white. "The jewels," he murmured. "I asked you about them. You said you lost them." Lillian's voice was barely a whisper. "It was easier than the truth. You already thought so little of me. I did not want you to think I was trying to buy your affection by saving your sister." The air seemed to leave the room. Alexander stared at his wife as if seeing her for the very first time. The woman he had dismissed as cold and calculating. The woman he had ignored and belittled. She had quietly, secretly, sacrificed everything she owned to protect his sister from ruin. And she had never asked for a single word of thanks. "All this time," he said, his voice raw, "all this time I thought." "You thought I was a schemer," Lillian finished gently. "I know, you made that very clear." Charlotte looked between them, her brow furrowing. "What is he talking about? Lillian, what scheme?" "It does not matter now, Charlotte." Lillian squeezed her hand and released it. "Welcome home. You and your family must be exhausted. I will have rooms prepared at once." She moved toward the stairs with the calm efficiency of a woman who had learned to manage every crisis, except the one inside her own heart. Alexander watched her go, and something inside him cracked wide open. He turned to follow her, but a cool voice stopped him. "How touching." Lady Karine stood in the doorway of the drawing room, her arms crossed, her beautiful face twisted with an expression that was not quite a smile. She had witnessed everything. "Karine," Alexander said flatly, "this is a family matter." "Oh, I can see that." She stepped closer, her silk skirts whispering against the marble floor. "But perhaps you would like to know the rest of the truth, Alexander, since we are all being so wonderfully honest today." He stiffened. "What do you mean?" Karine tilted her head, and for the first time the mask slipped entirely. Beneath the charm was something bitter and spiteful. "The letter. The one you received before your engagement. The one that told you dear Lillian was trapping you." Alexander's blood turned to ice. "How do you know about that letter?" "Because I wrote it." The words hung in the air like a blade. Charlotte gasped. Daniel pulled his children closer. Alexander did not move. He could not move. "You," he said. His voice was dangerously quiet. "Yes, me." Karine's laugh was brittle and joyless. "I married my Earl for his title, but I never stopped wanting you. When I heard you were to marry that insipid little mouse, I could not bear it. So I made sure you would never love her. I made sure you would resent her from the very first day. And it worked beautifully, did it not? 3 years of misery, all because of a few lines of ink." Alexander's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You destroyed my marriage. You destroyed Lillian's happiness. For what? For jealousy." "For love," Karine shot back, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I loved you. I still love you, and I will not apologize for fighting for what I wanted." "Get out." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of a shout. "Get out of my house. Now." Karine's bravado flickered. "Alexander." "Now." She lifted her chin, her dignity crumbling around her like ash. Without another word, she turned and swept toward the door. A footman scrambled to open it, and then she was gone, swallowed by the gray afternoon. The hall was silent again. Charlotte reached out and touched her brother's arm. "Alexander, go to her. Go to Lillian." He looked at his sister, his eyes haunted. "I have ruined everything. She will never forgive me." "You will not know until you try." He nodded once, a jerky, desperate motion, and then he was running up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, his heart pounding so hard he could barely breathe. He found Lillian in her chambers. She was standing by the window, her back to the door, a small leather trunk open on the bed. Inside were a few folded gowns, a book of poetry, her mother's locket. She was packing. The sight hit him like a physical blow. Lillian. She did not turn. "I heard what Lady Karine said. I was on the landing." "Then you know it was all a lie. Everything I believed, everything I held against you, it was a lie." "Yes," her voice was calm, terribly calm. "I know." He took a step closer, then another, until he was close enough to see the tremor in her shoulders that betrayed her composure. "Then, why are you packing?" She finally turned. Her eyes were dry, but her face was etched with a sorrow so deep it made his chest ache. "Because knowing the truth does not change what happened. It does not erase 3 years of loneliness. It does not undo every night I cried myself to sleep. Every morning I woke up hoping you might look at me the way you looked at her. Every moment I wondered what was so wrong with me that my own husband could not bear to be in the same room. Each word was a knife, and Alexander felt every one. I was blind. I was a fool, I know that, but I am begging you, Lillian, do not leave. Give me a chance to make this right. How? She whispered. How do you make right 3 years of neglect? I do not know. His voice broke, and to his shock he felt the sting of tears in his own eyes. Alexander Ashworth, Duke of Delamere, who had not cried since he was a boy, felt the hot tracks of tears on his cheeks. I do not know how, but I will spend the rest of my life trying. I will earn your trust. I will earn your smile. I will earn the right to hear you call me by my name again. Just, please, please do not go. She stared at him, her lips parted, her own eyes filling with tears. You never wanted me here. I did not know what I wanted. I was too proud, too stubborn, too consumed by old wounds to see what was right in front of me. A woman of courage and grace and goodness. A woman who saved my sister and asked for nothing in return. A woman I do not deserve, but one I cannot live without. He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. He took her hand, and the feel of her fingers, cold and trembling in his, undid him completely. I love you, he said. The words came out raw and broken and utterly true. I think I have loved you for a long time, but I was too afraid to admit it, too afraid to be vulnerable again, and I almost lost you because of it. I love you, Lillian, and I am so sorry that it took me this long to say it. A sob escaped her, and then another. She pressed her free hand to her mouth, trying to hold them back, but the tears came anyway, streaming down her cheeks, and Alexander could not stop himself. He pulled her into his arms, gently, reverently, as if she were made of spun glass. She did not resist. She crumpled against his chest, her fingers clutching the fabric of his coat, and she cried. She cried for all the years of silence, for all the hope that had withered, for the love she had given and the love she had never received. He held her through it, his own tears falling into her hair, his lips pressing soft, desperate kisses to her temple. I am here, he murmured. I am here, and I am not going anywhere. I have you. I have you, my darling, my dearest heart. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, the trunk on the bed forgotten, the gray afternoon light softening into dusk. When her sobs finally quieted, she pulled back just enough to look at him. Her eyes were red, her face blotchy, and she had never looked more beautiful to him. Alexander, she whispered. His name. She had said his name. The sound of it shattered something inside him and rebuilt it all at once. Say it again, he breathed. Alexander, a tiny, trembling smile touched her lips. I never stopped loving you, even when I tried, even when I wanted to, I never could. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. Then let me love you now. Let me love you the way you deserved from the very beginning. She nodded, a single small motion, and he lowered his forehead to hers. They stood together in the quiet room, breathing the same air, their hearts beating in a rhythm that was finally, blessedly, the same. The days that followed were not a fairy tale. Healing, Lillian learned, was not a single moment. It was 1,000 small ones. It was Alexander bringing her tea in the orangery, sitting beside her in comfortable silence. It was him walking with her to the tenant farms, listening as she explained the new irrigation system, his hand resting at the small of her back. It was late-night conversations by the fire, where he told her about his father, his fears, his regrets, and she told him about the quiet despair she had hidden for so long. Some wounds took longer to close than others. There were still moments when she flinched at a careless word, when old shadows flickered in her eyes. But Alexander never wavered. He met her pain with patience, her doubts with steadfast devotion. And slowly, week by week, the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble. He learned to make her laugh. He discovered that she loved wild strawberries and had baskets of them brought to her room. He found her one evening in the music room, playing a piece he had once mentioned in passing years ago, and he stood in the doorway listening until she finished. When she looked up and saw him there, his eyes were wet. "I do not deserve you," he said. She rose from the piano bench and walked to him, taking his hands. "We are neither of us perfect, but we are here together. That is what matters." Summer deepened, and Charlotte and her little family became a joyful fixture at Delamere. The halls rang with children's laughter, and the gardens bloomed with a riot of color. The tenants prospered under Lillian's quiet guidance, and Alexander found himself watching his wife with a mixture of pride and wonder that never quite faded. One evening, as they walked through the rose garden, the sky painted in shades of lavender and gold, Alexander stopped and turned to her. "I have something for you." He drew a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside lay a ring, not the heavy family heirloom she wore on formal occasions, but a delicate band of gold set with a single pearl, surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my mother," he said softly. "She told me to give it to the woman I loved more than my own life. I should have given it to you on our wedding day. I was too much of a fool, but I am not a fool anymore." He slipped it onto her finger, beside the wedding band she had worn through all the lonely years. It fit perfectly. Lillian looked at the ring, then at her husband, and the love in her eyes was so bright it stole his breath. "It is beautiful." "Not as beautiful as you." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. "I meant what I said that day. I will spend the rest of my life making you happy. I swear it." She stepped closer, rising on her toes, and pressed a kiss to his lips. It was soft and sweet and full of promise. When she pulled back, she was smiling, a real smile, the kind that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "You already are," she said. And in the golden light of that summer evening, with the scent of roses all around them and the sound of Charlotte's children laughing in the distance, the Duke and Duchess of Delamere walked back toward the great house hand in hand. Not as strangers bound by duty, but as two people who had weathered the storm and found, at last, the shelter of each other's hearts. The long winter of their marriage had ended. Spring had come, tender and new, and with it, the quiet, steadfast hope of a love that would never again be taken for granted. In the months that followed, Lillian discovered a new kind of joy, the joy of being truly seen. Alexander discovered the profound peace of being truly loved. And when, one soft spring morning, Lillian placed his hand on her stomach and whispered that their family would soon grow by one more, the Duke of Delamere wept for the second time in his life. But these were not tears of grief or regret. They were tears of pure, overwhelming gratitude. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her hands. "I love you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you more than words can say." And Lillian, her own eyes shining, placed her palm against his heart and felt it beating strong and steady beneath her touch. "I know," she whispered. "I have always known. I was just waiting for you to know it too." He pulled her into his arms and held her close, cradling her against his chest as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Because she was. She always had been. He had simply been too blind to see it. But now, with the warmth of her body against his and the promise of their future growing between them, Alexander Ashworth made a silent vow. He would spend every day of the rest of his life showing her the love she had always deserved. And he would never, ever make her wait again. The great house of Delamere stood serene in the morning light, its windows gleaming, its gardens bursting with life. Inside, a husband and wife held each other, and the last shadows of the past melted away like frost beneath the sun. It was, at last, the beginning of everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching and see you in the next amazing story.